In round 4 of the European Team Championships, Magnus Carlsen is paired again with a player who is 300 points lower rated than him. So that's going to be very interesting. Let's have a look at the game. Magnus playing with black against Finland's number 1 Toivo Keinanen. It's a strong player, 2527 rated. Board 1 of Finland. He is still an international master, but very soon he will probably be a grandmaster as well. And it's interesting to see how much risk Magnus is willing to take. As we have already seen in the previous rounds that, things can easily go wrong for him. Remember his black game earlier against Dragnev from Austria. So if you haven't seen that game yet, make sure to become a subscriber to this channel. I will cover all the interesting games from this tournament as well as many other interesting games which are going to be played in the very near future. Let's have a look at this game. Keinanen playing with white goes for the move 1d4, knight of 6, and we do get to see a Catalan opening. White is going to fianchetto the bishop to g2, d5, bishop g2, bishop e7, knight of 3, castle, castle. And well, we have a very well-known position in which black normally just takes the pawn on c4. This has been played thousands of times. We are not going there today as Magnus opts for a very well-known sideline. Well, actually maybe not well-known, but it's a move he has played before in a number of games in the World Cup in 2021. He was playing with the black pieces against Radoslav Wojtasek. He has repeated it a few times later, but this must have come as a small surprise for Keinanen, who didn't go for the main move queen c2. Other logical developing move is knight c3, but instead he goes for the move bishop f4, and only now Magnus captures the pawn on c4. Queen a4 played, white is about to regain the pawn, and now the knight comes into d5. And I think this is the reason why the move bishop f4 is slightly unusual. Black is about to even play the move knight b6 to attack the queen, to protect the pawn. So white captures the pawn, and now after knight takes f4, g takes f4, we have a very well-known structure arising from these Catalan openings. White has given up voluntarily the bishop pair, but hopes to get a nice grip in the center with an extra pawn on f4. White does have a grip on the e5 square, but the pawn structure is still flexible. And once the position will get opened, hopefully black is able to activate both its bishops. Let's have a look. Knight d7 played, rook d1, c6. The queen goes back to c2, knight f6, knight c3. The reason is that the queen is somewhat more flexible on c2, whereas on c4 it's more vulnerable, can easily come under an attack by a pawn or a minor piece of black. So queen is okay here. Knight e5, black attacks the pawn on f4, e3, bishop d7, knight e5, and now the bishop goes to e8. So this is everything going according to plan for black. Black is just about to kick the knight out with the move f6. And later, this bishop, which is usually a very passive piece, can come either to g6 or maybe to h5. And then the bishop is much more actively placed than it's on its original square c8. So white goes for the move f5. He's trying to undouble the pawn and put more pressure against that knight on d5. As once that pawn on e6 is no longer there, well, there are some ideas for white. So let's see. Black play the move f6, attacking the knight. Now you're for a choice. The knight went back to f3, logical, but on the other hand, maybe d3 could have been a better square, so that after, let's say, pawn captures f5, you can take on d5, c takes d5, and now the knight comes to f4 to attack the d5 square. Together with the bishop, the knight even threatens a fork on e6. So the big difference is that the knight is much more actively placed on f4 than it is on f3, where it's just standing there but cannot really go to an active square. It also obstructs the bishop. So I think Magnus is happy here. He captures the pawn on f5, knight takes d5, c takes d5. The idea is that now, compared to the other line with the knight on d3, the diagonal for the queen is open, so queen takes f5, but now the queen is chased away with the move g6. Queen goes back to d3, and Magnus grabs some space on the queen side. Places the pawn on a4, so maybe later you have ideas maybe to come with the queen to b6 to attack the pawn. Various ideas here for black. Rook ac1, king g7, and now white moves the knight back from f3 to e1. So what is the idea? Well, the knight is trying to get to a better square as it's on its way to d3. Bishop d6, and now the bishop is looking wonderful on this diagonal. There's no time to capture this pawn on d5 because of bishop takes h2. With a check, black regains the pawn, and now white's king is wide open. This looks incredibly dangerous for white. So understandably, white keeps this bishop on the board, goes for the move rook c2, and after queen d7, white doubles the rooks on the c file. But as you can see, all the entry squares are covered by black's pieces, so there's no way to infiltrate into black's position here yet. So what is black going to do here? Well, Magnus played the move bishop f7 to protect this pawn. Very understandable. Should be said though that g5 is also an interesting idea, planning to get his bishop to g6 to attack the queen and hit the rook on c2 indirectly as well. Was not played, bishop f7 on the board, queen e2. White continues with the plan of getting the knight to a better square. So here again, we see the bishop is on a free diagonal, not hindered by its own knight. The knight has ideas, sometimes going to f4. Well, maybe not now because there's bishop takes f4 and you don't want to take back with your e-pawn. But the knight can also come to c5. That's a nice square, so black covers that square by playing the move b6. And, well, it's sort of status quo here on the board. Like white has the possibility to exchange all the rooks. But, well, I think in that case, black has absolutely nothing to fear. And there's no need giving up the control over the file yet. But what should white do? There's not an active plan. This bishop on d6 ensures that the knight on d3 doesn't have a good square to go to here right now. So I think it's not an easy position, but white can just make a waiting move, maybe prepare the exchange of rooks on the c file, and probably position is still more or less equal. But in the game, there follow the move a3. So what is the idea? It's a waiting move, preventing black from ever advancing the pawn to b4. I think that's one idea, but probably Keinanen underestimated black's next move, as there is rook c4. That's an excellent idea. And now this move, it's something black could have played in any position, but had the pawn still been on a2, there is this possibility to tickle this rook with the b pawn. Now this is no longer possible, as after a takes b3, the pawn is not on a2, cannot recapture the pawn. So rook c4 is an excellent move. It's supported by the pawn on d5 as well as the bishop on f7. White's idea here is to go knight b4. Bishop takes, rook takes c4 first, d takes c4, and a takes b4. And the position has drastically changed. Now we no longer have this clash of bishop pair versus bishop and knight. It's an imbalance in pawn structure. White has a pawn center, but it cannot easily come forward yet. Black, on the other hand, has a majority on the queen side. Some pawns there. Maybe the pawn on on b4 can be attacked anytime soon. And also, I think white's king is somewhat more vulnerable. Let's have a look what happened now. Black first goes for the move b5. Wise decision to support these pawns. Queen d2, protecting the pawn on b4. And now g5 is played. This is an excellent idea, as black is starting an expansion on the king side. Queen c3, rook d8. So it will be harder for white to push this pawn to e4. Therefore, rook d1 played first. So there are ideas to go d5 at the right moment, but bishop d5 is an excellent move. And now Magnus, it looks as if he's just going for the exchange of bishops, but he is setting a trap. If you capture the bishop on d5, it's queen g4. You're not going to recapture the bishop on d5, but you set up a double attack, hitting both the rook and the king. Black is winning material, so you cannot do that. At the same time, it's not even possible to play the move e4, because of bishop takes e4 with the same trick. Bishop takes e4, queen g4, and the rook will be taken next. So after bishop d5, white played the move f3. And that is, of course, somehow a weakening move. but you're preparing to advance your e-pawn. Queen d6. So now, if you play the move e4, you're attacking the bishop. Bishop goes away, but the queen likely comes to f4, and their idea is to open up white's king's position very fast. So no need to play e4. They follow the move rook d2. It's a waiting move, but here we see white is kind of stuck, and black improves its position by launching its h-pawn. h5, rook f2, and now h4. The h-pawn is coming forward, and it becomes an attacking tool. The bishop goes to h3. This is the reason the rook is on f2 to protect the pawn. Bishop is more active, may come to f5 for instance. Bishop e6. Black is offering the exchange of bishops. And now we have a pure queen and rook endgame. But I never really like to call these positions endgames because the best pieces are still on the board and it's all about king safety. We will still get to see quite a number of interesting tactical ideas. I think white should play as actively as possible. It's a rule of thumb in such positions, and try to use your assets. I think e4 with the idea to go d5. At least you're pushing your pawns, and well, it will make it harder for black to activate its best pieces. But instead, Keinanen brings its king to the center. King f1 played, and now the pawn goes to h3. Very nice move. We will see how strong this move is within a couple of moves. King e2, and now move 40. Magnus play the move f5, and wait a second, it's opening the diagonal towards the black king, but d5, does that win the queen? You're giving a discovered check, and obviously you got to do something about the queen, but there's queen f6, and fortunately for Keinanen, he didn't go for this line, because this endgame, it's really bad. The king comes in, you're putting pressure on these pawns, and later black has ideas to create a passed pawn on the king side. Looks really, really bad. So therefore, no d5, king d2 is played, and here move like king g6 is a safe way of making progress, but queen d5 played. Now the king went back to c1. So this was the entire idea. White wanted to bring the king to the other side of the board where it's safe, and then hopefully at some point you can open the position, proving that the king on g7 is vulnerable. But Magnus wants to seize the initiative, and he needs to look for a pawn break. Is it either going to be f4 or g4? Well, if you play g4, you retain excellent chances to either infiltrate with the queen, maybe at some point exchange the rooks, maybe there's a pawn break with g3, as you have a 2 versus 1 that could create a passed pawn for black. However, Magnus had a different idea. He played here the move f4. His idea is to undermine the pawn on e3. After e takes f4, g takes f4, black is about to take the pawn on d4, which is targeted by both the queen and the rook. But certainly Magnus underestimated this move. Queen e1, it's a backward move, but the pawn on d4 cannot be taken. It runs into queen e7, and there will follow a bunch of checks. White is okay and will save the game. There's no time for black to give checkmate here himself. The queen is way too strong. Therefore, the move king f7 was played to cover the entry square on e7. And now, I think the best way for white here to proceed is this move, rook e2. You're not caring about these two pawns, but you're preparing to come in with your rook to e7. If black neutralizes that threat by moving a rook or queen to cover that square, then white has the additional option of moving the queen now to h4 with new ideas to give checks. Here we see that the black king is more vulnerable, and at least white has a perpetual as a minimum. But I think Keinanen lost the momentum here, and rather than going for the initiative, he wanted to play it solid. He goes for the exchange of queens with the move queen e4. Queen takes e4, f takes e4. Looks still like this is nice. If black takes on d4, it's rook takes f4. Looks as if you're okay. But rather than taking the pawn, black goes for rook g8. That's a great idea, with ideas of coming in with the rook to g1 with check, for instance. But there's also another idea, as we will soon see. Rook takes f4 check, king e6. White is a pawn up in this rook endgame, but the pawns are not that dangerous yet. And thanks to this pawn on h3, there is a lot of counterplay with rook g1. Now, White went back with the rook to f2. Another idea here in rook endgames is try to play it active. For instance, you go for the move rook h4. Now after a check on g1, king c2, you have another check on the second rank. The king comes forward and you can take the pawn on h2. But very likely, white is just absolutely okay. You have checks, the rook is controlling the pawn from behind. I think this should be, technically speaking, an easy draw. However, rook f2 was played, and now Magnus goes for rook g2, offering the exchange of rooks. And of course, white cannot do that, because after h takes g2, the g-pawn is going to be promoted next. So here, white is for a choice, what you're going to do with your rook. In the game there followed rook c2, but if you play a move like d5, trying to play actively, it will be much easier draw for white. King e5, rook f5 check. Now if you do take the pawn, you go behind that passed pawn yourself. The rook is well placed on h5 and the king is no longer in distance of this d-pawn. After rook takes h2, it's d6. The pawn will be pushed forward, so black has to make a concession or give a number of checks, and probably the h-pawn will be lost. So this is going to be a draw for sure. However, rook c2 was played, so white is saying, okay, you can now go for the exchange of rooks, but then I take back with the king, and you don't have a passed pawn. That's the main difference. But rook g1, this is Magnus at his best. King d2, and he goes for the move rook g4, putting pressure on these pawns. Now you think, what is this crazy idea? White can, for instance, just play a move like king e3, and the king has been activated. No way! In that case, there would have followed rook g2, and now the king can no longer keep the rook defended, and the exchange of rooks is not recommendable, because even though you're in the square, within the square, you're controlling, neutralizing this g-pawn, there is this plan of creating this breakthrough. This is something Magnus had seen. You deflect the pawn from b2, and after b takes c3, there's a3, and the a-pawn is decisive. Black wins the game. This is a fantastic, very subtle trap, so that white cannot activate its king. The king went back to c1. Now the pawn on e4 was taken anyway, so materials even again. Rook c3 played. Here you can take the pawn on d4, but then the pawn on h3 is hanging. Magnus played the move rook h4, temporarily deactivating the rook, but the king is coming to d5. Let's see. King b1, king d5, rook g3, and now the pawn on d4 is taken. Here, instead of being a pawn down, black is a pawn up and pushing for a win, and this is far from simple. White played here the move king c2, trying to activate the king a bit, but it's rook e4 with the idea to come in with the rook to e2 with check and win the pawn on h2. White is for a choice. What should he do? In the game, the pawn on h3 was taken, but this is a crucial mistake. Better would have been to play here the move king d2 so that the rook cannot come in, and on the next move you can take the pawn on h3. Why is rook takes h3 not a good idea? There is this move, rook to e2 check. The king is forced to go back to the back rank, and now another brilliant idea. Rook e3. Again, Magnus making use of the fact that the king and pawn endgame is winning. After rook takes e3, king takes e3, the plan is simple. You're picking up the pawn on h2. You're just in the square. Just make sure that the h-pawn can never be queened. And after that, you come back with your king and know that white is not able to activate his king. If the king goes around here, then you have the breakthrough motive with c3, as we have seen earlier. So the pawn endgame is winning. White cannot go for the exchange of rooks. If you play another move, let's say rook h4, the king comes forward to d3. And this is a huge difference. In the game, instead of rook check, they followed rook h5. White attacks the pawn on b5. But now after a3, white is dead lost. There's this idea to deflect the pawn from b2 again. If you do take the pawn, this was not played in the game, but let me show you this. It's king c3, brilliant move. Rook takes b5, king b3, mating threat on e1. The king is hiding behind this pawn on b4. So the rook, the white rook, is not able to give a check. King c1, c3, renewing the mating threat. If you go king d1, you push the pawn. King d2, rook c3, threatening to promote the pawn. And after king c1, only way to stop the passed pawn, it's rook d3. And on the next move, it's checkmate on d1. An absolutely fantastic line. Therefore, the pawn cannot be taken. White played here the move rook g5, but this is also not gonna help. After rook b3, the rook is about to take the pawn on b2. Rook g4 check was played. Be careful. Don't go to d3 to the third rank because of a rook check. And this time the king and pawn endgame is lost because after taking the rook and b takes a3, all the pawns will be eliminated next. Therefore the king has to go back. After rook g5, king e4, the pawn is still hanging. Rook takes b5 played, rook takes b2 check, king goes to c1, and now pawn to c3. Very important idea. You're about to go for the move a2 next, and the pawn on c3 protects the rook. They followed the move rook a5, but here Keinanen realized that it's just game over, and he resigned because black can just play here a2, and the pawn is way too strong. And compared with the white pawns, they are nowhere. If you, for instance, play a move like h4, it's rook b1 check. For instance, there are many other good ways to convert as well. This is the most human continuation, to give a rook check on the first rank and promote a pawn. Rook takes, it's game over. For me, this was just typical Magnus style. Like, he had a nice playable position out of the opening, clever opening choice, and then a playable position. He was maybe better pressing. He made a mistake, and probably he even realized it during the game that he has almost given away its entire advantage. But then he keeps on finding fantastic resources. This is the Magnus we love to see. Let me know in the comments what you think of this game, and I will show you much more in the upcoming videos. See you soon.